how did you experience, and what's your view on remote working, how it has impacted the way you manage conflict and innovation in your organization or as a leader? We first start with Sofie, then Kirsty, then Sylvia, and then Rob. So I give you the microphone, Sofie.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you very much for also inviting me to what promises to be a very interesting panel, rethinking operational effectiveness, with what I see being professionals from Greece to Kenya and from Japan to LA, while I say hello from the beautiful Luxembourg. I've seen many familiar names and faces joining our virtual meeting space. So of course, I also speak under the close supervision of some of the ESM colleagues that I see here in the room, in the virtual room. And as there are also some lawyers amongst them, and while I understand from Suzanne that everything will be on the record, I wish to add that it is a disclaimer that nothing of what I say can be used against me after this session. No, but all joking apart, as Suzanne mentioned, I'm indeed the COO at the European Stability Mechanism, in charge of the 3 divisions: IT, facilities management, business strategy, project management, and HR and organization. In addition, I'm also the leader of our so-called incident management team, which is a team that deals with our internal pandemic response. So you can imagine that this topic is very close to my heart. And as a crisis resolution mechanism, I think efficiently dealing with uncertainty and conflict and remaining agile and innovative are for us not just nice to have at ESM. It's critical for everything we do, for our operations, our mission, our success. And it may be interesting to know also, for those who do not know us, we're very small in size. We're around 200 staff, but we count more than 40 different nationalities among our people, coming from very diverse professional backgrounds, having worked in both the public, private sector, representing all workforce generations, and which makes DSM, of course, a very multicultural and diverse workplace environment. So I would say already in normal times, working in such a diverse and fast-paced environment means that conflict is inevitable, and I would say even necessary to stimulate innovation, efficiency, and growth. But this pandemic crisis and the related move to remote working by very large parts of our organization over now an extended period of time is, of course, an extreme test of our readiness and resilience, I would say both on an individual and an organizational level. Because what we see is that in the disruption of crisis, there's, I would say, great potential for fear, for friction, for conflict. But on the other hand, in my view, there's also a real opportunity, an opportunity to be aspirational and innovative, because the adversity of the situation can, in my experience, also really unite a team to rise to the occasion, learn from these experiences and perform at its best. But here I would put immediately a caveat, a but. There is a but. I think we as leaders need to create the right conditions for such a positive energy, positive transformation, because only if we can shift the needle from the instinctive fear in such a crisis and the anxiety that surrounds it, or perhaps even the alienation, into, we need to actually move the needle into more positive territory. And I think then we can create a healthy conflict culture where we also have, I would say, the motivation to continue pushing ourselves, to continue learning, to continue adopting new ways of working. And now you may say, well, Sofie, that sounds all good and fine in theory, but what in practice? So how has it impacted DSM? I would say there is not a magical recipe here. Let me highlight some of the conditional efforts that we've been doing during the crisis and the related remote working to mitigate the impact of this crisis and how we've even already started learning from it. Well, firstly, I would say I would highlight actually the unshakable commitment to our core values and principles. For us, this is not a time for politics, it's about people, and the safety of our people comes first, and we ensure that all our decisions reflect that. And for us, this has been and still is our top priority. In addition, we also call for both empathy and positive action to guide our people through this. Stay positive, be aspirational, because we also see, in addition to being a health crisis, it's also an emotional crisis. We see, of course, that the rates of stress and anxiety, the potential for conflict are higher than ever. And in such situations, people often operate from fear, contributing negative energy, perhaps even sharing worst case scenarios. And here is where our leaders need to reassure and encourage people to move indeed that needle to more positive territory. There are, of course, many conditions that affect us all and that are beyond our control. But we need to create such an environment of psychological safety where really our people can show vulnerability. We see extremely challenging times, and I believe all the people here probably joining the session, I would dare say that we at some point in time all have been confronted with very difficult emotions, feeling anxious, confused, overwhelmed, powerless. And we really try to promote at DSM the fact that showing such emotions, asking for help, which is often seen as a sign of weakness, but in my view requires real courage and trust. It's not easy. And we try to really mitigate those emotions together with our people and perhaps even externally with our stakeholders, because we believe that this really creates enduring bonds and also provides our people with a sense of belonging. And then thirdly, what I would perhaps as a third element want to highlight is the need to ensure that also diversity and inclusion remains a top priority also during this crisis. Because I think in addition to keeping our people safe and ensuring so the physical and the psychological safety, people need to feel engaged, stimulated and included. And I think only then will they be able to bring their ingenuity and potential to work and really deal positively, as you mentioned it, Suzanne, the positive, healthy conflict culture. And I think in these remote circumstances, it's of course not easy. Leading inclusively during these challenging times is harder. It's human nature to, for example, also default in this remote setting to people who feel familiar, who feel safe, and with perhaps the fewer casual conversations and water cooler moments. Some people may find it harder to connect with colleagues or even get access to their leaders, their managers, to make their voice heard. And that's why for us it's also critical the impact to mitigate the impact of this remote working through staying in very close contact with all team members, to nip potential feelings of alienation in the bud, allow for constructive conflict, and to ensure that not everyone not only feels but also really is included. And I think these are the impacts that we feel, of course, are more on an emotional level, but I believe that the decision made and the actions taken in such trying times will resonate far beyond the present, and the way that we respond now will shape our organizations for years to come. So therefore, focusing on such elements like care, connection, inclusion, in my view, are not only the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. It makes our organization healthier today and better prepared for future turbulence. So that's why when being invited to this panel, I immediately felt very enthusiastic, and I very much look forward to hearing the views of my fellow panelists, of the colleagues from CEDAR, and also of all of you here in this virtual room. Very much look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Sofie. Very, very good. Thank you. Kirsty.
Hello, nice to be here. Thanks. And Sofie ruined my start because I really hoped to disagree with her and at least create a little bit of conflict in the room. And I tried to take some notes. I couldn't find anything to disagree with, but maybe I build, and also for context, the work that we're doing with Suzanne and the work that I'm doing in general has two levels for me. So I have a small specialist team, but we're responsible apparently for the culture and inclusion and diversity at AXA, and that's 54 countries, 160,000 people. So that's kind of difficult already to imagine how we might even imagine that we would influence that. But I want to bounce first of all off of what you said, Sofie, about inclusion. And of course, inclusion is a little bit my background, so I could talk for the whole hour about that, and I won't, but I agree that inclusion's a clear part. And what I observe, and like I say, the work applies to my small team, but also to the way that we think about the change across the world. We have some experience already of remote working because we are a global organization. So we're used to not being in the room, but we're definitely not used to this and not being together. And I think there is a risk of people feeling excluded, definitely. But I also think this is, and I'm going to make a big statement, but I think it's a change of it's a chance of a lifetime, or a chance of a career at least, to impact culture. So this is a break in our normal way of working, and that gives us an extraordinary opportunity to come back and rebuild in the right way. And at AXA, that's what we want to focus on. We want to take the things that we've learned here and rebuild a new working culture that will be a little bit more remote, because I think we will all be a little bit revisiting the way that we work and using what we've learned in the positive sense to leverage it well. I liked what you said, Sofie, about conflict being necessary. And I think one of the things we've observed is there's a risk that we lose some of the conflict. There are two possibilities, and everything I'm going to say is a contradiction. So either you lose the conflict because people are behind the screen and it's a little bit more difficult to interrupt, it's a little bit more difficult to create that healthy debate that goes on. And on the other hand, what can happen is because we're not quite together and we don't get the clues, the visual clues, the body language, the smell that you get when you're in the room of what's going on, that conflicts are misunderstood. And I think that leads me really to my first point that we've observed is that we move a lot from implicit to explicit. So communication, team building, everything that happens from a manager because you're together, because it happens naturally, now need to actually be really thought about and explicitly done. And conflict needs to be explicit. So we need to come back after a meeting and check in and say, was that okay? Did you agree? Were you quiet because it was okay? Or were you quiet because you didn't feel that you could make your feeling known? So there's a lot of moving from those implicit cultural things to explicit, which is wonderful for me because I don't know how else you talk about culture. So all of those things that managers should have been doing well in the past, that they thought they knew, that it was hard to tell them they were getting wrong, now sometimes they start to feel it. So I think one thing is to move to explicit, and then it's very linked. It's almost saying the same thing, but even more explicitly, to talk about those things that we couldn't talk about. And again, Sophie, you mentioned mental health. And I think mental health, depending on which country you're in, I'm based in France. It's not quite the same as the UK, where we are a little bit more at ease talking about things like mental health. We can have a discussion about checking in with people, about making those emotional bonds, and in the same way about conflict. So it brings to the table the discussions that might have been hard. And you'll know, Sophia, you were head of HR before. Some of the HR topics, you know, they're the easy things, they're the soft things, they're the last thing on the agenda. Right now, we're top of the agenda. So let's take that opportunity and start talking about conflict, talking about mental health, talking about including people, as you said. And that gives us a chance to change and be, and I want to make the link because I realized the question was about innovation as well. I think the innovation thing is double-sided. Whenever there's a big change, the chance and the opportunity for innovation is huge. So I see a great increase in innovation, and yet I see a great challenge to be innovative and creative and together. So I think this is an ongoing challenge that we're going to have, but the fact that we have a chance to be more explicit about our decisions, more explicit about the things that are in business are implicit and difficult to talk about, is a great opportunity for all of us as leaders to review the way we work together, the way we include, the way we're innovative, and finally, and very importantly, the way we manage conflict. Thanks, Sophie. It was a great intro for me.
Thank you, Kirsty. Wonderful. Thank you for that. And over to Sylvia.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'd like to pick up on two things, Sofie and Kirsty, that impressed me, and that is very much present also at the EIB, European Investment Bank, where I work, is caring, connecting, and inclusion. Being that we've all realized that this is becoming more and more part of like essential leadership, and it's good for business. And the other part is indeed, and I will say a few things later on, is that what used to be implicit now has to be explicit. So what was so easy around the water cooler or a cup of coffee, now how do we do that? And a lot what I have seen is that we have to make it explicit. We have to actually put words to it, which what came with a gesture. Now, let me share a little bit about the European Investment Bank and our experience. Of course, like for everyone else or organizations, the switch to remote work has had a huge impact on us. Luckily, we're already pretty well equipped. Many of our employees had laptops and were already teleworking occasionally. So we were equipped and many managers were used to it. A good and innovative impact has been that those managers who were not so used to it or hesitant had to like get along. And we actually got the feedback from many, I didn't like this before, but I must admit it works. So maybe we should try more of that. And there also I would like to link with Kirsty and Sofie. It's a huge opportunity for innovation. So we have to actually seize that, to bring more flexibility, flatter hierarchies, and more like the human side, the EQ into it, that where previously people said we can't talk about this, and now we have learned, well, actually we have to talk about it. Now, interesting also is I used to be responsible for organizational health at the bank. And what I was doing there was counseling, conflict management, and the connecting and caring next to also the medical side. But because I did a lot on conflict management advisory to leaders and also on like strategic initiatives, how we can improve the European Investment Bank as an institution, people asked me like a couple of years ago, Sylvia, do you want to take over leadership development, like drive leadership development? So that's what I'm doing now. And in the lockdown, first lockdown in particular, people came to us, like managers came to us, what do we do now? It's really difficult. They were already stretched before, and now they had to switch to like, how do I keep cohesion in this situation now? How do I take care of my people when I don't see them? How do I distribute and manage work fairly? And very importantly, how do I deal with tensions in my team? And how do I deal with difficult people? For instance, I had this one manager who I had been supporting before. He said, you know, this guy who is always a bit difficult, I have to have a conversation with him. And I feel that he's kind of hiding behind his computer. He doesn't even want to put on the video. And he's becoming more cocky than usually. So how do I do that? Normally I would have invited him to my office, like with my body language, showing him like, now we sit down and now we have a conversation. How do I do it now? And that's where the explicit comes in. So I would like us to talk with a video, for instance. And the explicit can also be in positive terms. How do I create safety with my words? Talking about it. Now, going a bit into the details, what we did at the start is we created a guide for managers, how to manage remotely, covering results, relationships, and resilience. So again, like the caring, connecting, the relationships, the communication very strongly, but of course also how do we create and maintain results. And one very important thing was that is actually related to conflict is how do we create clarity? Because our managers were often used to, like, we say it in the corridor, we clarified it at the meeting. Now, when we don't have that so regularly, we have to be clearer about agreements. And that is actually fantastic news, because when we are clear on agreements, we prevent conflict because we really have a solid foundation for the work. And we can even come back to that for accountability later on. So these were very positive lessons. Let me also say a few things about like what has been difficult. We saw that while there was less friction, there was also more story building. Like people being at home, and on dit en français, on se fait un film. We're making a film in the mind about what the other person is doing and saying. And whereas at the office, we could check on that more easily. At the remote situation, for the manager, the challenge was, how do I go to my people and say, are you sure about this? Have you talked to that person? Could you please talk to them? Or also be aware of your assumptions. And so there's an active work needed from the manager to bring people together. And if I boil down the explicit maybe to two things, is what I've been telling managers again and again is be more attentive in your observations and be more intentional in your actions. So whereas before it was easier to observe something, now it's more difficult. So we have to really watch out and be attentive. And we have to be more intentional. Like, how do I create safety? In a conversation? Before I ask the person for a coffee, and now I can't do this. How do I do it then? So I say a few words. I actually ask about how they're doing. I share about myself. I clarify my intentions for the meeting. I show that I can. I use my voice in a certain way. So if I want to create a relaxed atmosphere, I'm making sure that I use also a relaxed voice and not like showing my own tensions that I feel because I have to talk to that person. So everything there has to be more intentional. And that is there where leadership training comes also in to help managers actually do that. And maybe one thing that is also really important finally is when a manager has to mediate between people, facilitate a conversation. What I've started to tell people is really watch out, look at the relationship, not only at like Bill and Mary, because if you look at Bill and then at Mary, again, you can undermine the relationship and you can create feelings of insecurity among them. Is she siding with Bill or is she siding with Mary? What's going on here? Whereas when you speak to the relationship, like even ask questions like, what does your relationship need? How is your relationship doing? You create actually the connection between the two people. You work from a place of neutrality. That is maybe something, it's useful in any case, but I would say as a tip for the virtual world, that is even more important.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Wow, that was a lot of good advice and tips already. Thank you. And Rob, you have.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm going to resist the temptation, not least because Suzanne will just tell me off, just to say, well, I follow three great speakers. Everything that they've just said, let's move on. I won't do that, but I do apologise for any repetition or just echoing of some of the great stuff that has been said thus far. That said, at Minerva, we've come at this from a slightly different perspective in terms of a lot of our work is to do with community and company conflict rather than internal company conflict. And so that tends to be our start point. Funny old thing, though, quite often this leads us back to actually looking at internal issues, because whilst companies quite legitimately will be asking themselves the question, what can we do to change the conflict that we're involved in? Well, yes, we can help you with that, but maybe you also need to ask yourself, how are we as a company going to change in light of this conflict? And that feedback mechanism is absolutely critical if conflict is going to be transformative and have all of the positives and opportunities that we've talked about. And I think that's one of the points I think I'd just reinforce in terms of setting the context for a few subsequent issues. Understanding the environment in which you're operating. Is it complicated or is it complex? And they are very different, and they have huge implications on the way in which you go about dealing with things and operating. And I think quite often we see people and companies operating and have very efficient ways of operating for complicated situations, but not necessarily for the complex. And in that complicated area, we have a desire to control, and you can control complicated things, but you can't necessarily do that with the complex. And the other problem with operating in complexity and the ramifications of COVID for all of us is thrown us all into complex situations. That is where we are operating. But the resilience becomes an issue of adaptation rather than returning to a norm. And this resonates with the innovation that's required in terms of dealing with conflict. It's all about adaptation rather than the returning to a waypoint. And this somebody's made this point in terms of dealing with that hierarchies and networks. In terms of how your internal companies are structured, hierarchies are great for the complicated, but if you want to really be able to operate in the complex, you need to have a much more networked approach to doing things. And so all of that, one of the problems that comes in with the hierarchies, of course, is the power structures that go with that. And if you want to move from one to the other, you know that is not a simple thing to do. So trying to set that as a little bit of context, the 3 points I would make. I think there are huge opportunities that come from the remote working piece of this, in terms of, done correctly, giving voice to those who didn't have a voice before. And I think that can therefore greatly increase your level of understanding and getting different perspectives, and potentially being able to look in the mirror and see something that you didn't see before, but perhaps is a more genuine perspective of your situation, because it's had more color put into it, because you've ultimately just been able to get more data points. There are issues with that, not least of which is how you gather some of that. But actually, if you can put those structures in place and enable some of that, then there is a real opportunity out of this. And you'll also potentially get more ideas flowing through of how to negotiate situations, how to navigate situations. And again, I think the remote working opportunity done correctly gives you more opportunity to conduct what I would call safe to fail experiments, because you don't necessarily have to do everything in the full gaze of all eyes around the office. You can do things a little bit more discreetly, which if you're looking to do internal change and navigate power structures, you're going to get things wrong. And that's why conducting different safe to fail experiments might be a good approach, because again, in complexity, you don't know what the answer is. You've got to go out and discover it. You can't know the answer. And actually, the answer might evolve as you go through that approach. So related to that, I would question, therefore, if you want to go down that method, how do your policies allow it? Again, coming back to this idea of control, when there's a shock to the system, our natural instinct is we want more control, we want to bring things close, we want to damage limitation, all of that good stuff that happens in response to a crisis. But in terms of then becoming resilient and adapting, have you put in place a whole load of policies that stop bad things from happening, or are they actually enabling good things to happen? And again, I think that's a good challenge that maybe companies can ask themselves, particularly around some of their remote working practices. How are people doing things organically? What's the stuff you are not seeing up the chain that might be a very much better way to operate, and that people are working around your policies because they haven't been correctly adapted, or they're not adapting quickly enough in this dynamic situation. And then my final point is, it's slightly off center from the remote working, but conflict in the virtual dimension. And I think this is something that's really become accelerated as remote working has increased. Understanding that the virtual landscape that you're operating in, the old conflict sort of dynamics of understanding positions, interests and needs, or behaviors, attitudes and values, but that sort of iceberg approach to understand those different bits, one needs to understand that in the virtual dimension as well. And I think as we communicate much more in that area, getting much more nuanced about it is going to be critical, because conflict is happening there. You will be involved in it. And for example, different platforms in which you might be getting into that conflict. It's like going to a different country. How well do you understand the platform? How well do you understand the language that's used in that platform, the culture that's used in that platform? And so conflict management in a virtual dimension rather than a remote working scenario is something that I think that we need to become, is going to become a much more important skill set, and something that we need to very much develop. That's me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. And thanks to all of you.